Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about why we use the max effort method, because this is one of the things that creates a lot of confusion, and it's something I feel that people need to understand, because anyone who's out there trying to get really strong, you need to be maxing out, and you need to be maxing out on at least a somewhat regular basis. Now, the way that we do it over in the conjugate method, which is how I've been training again for quite a while, it's how I have a large number of my own clients train, is that we do max out on 2 lifts every single week. And there's always confusion with it. And I think one of the biggest points of confusion is when someone sees you doing an exercise that we might not think of as a particularly good exercise, right? An exercise that I may have told people in the past, hey, if you do rep work with that, you can injure yourself. Or that doesn't produce particularly good muscle growth. Or that's not the best way to develop and build strength, right? We say these things and people say, well, why would you max on that exercise then? Well, that's a great question. Because we max out for the reasons that we max out. And because we don't max out for the purpose of doing rep work, we don't max out for the purpose of doing things like that to where we're trying to build extra muscle. We max out for completely different reasons. All right, number one, maxing out teaches you how to learn how to strain. It teaches you to learn how to grind, right? Because you guys are going to see me miss a lift here in a second down at the bottom. But that's what the max effort method does. It teaches you to strain against a really, really heavy weight. And when we're talking about building maximum strength, no matter how much strength potential you have, and strength potential can be built with rep work, by the way. You could build an enormous amount of strength potential doing a bunch of 10 rep sets. If you got really jacked doing 10 rep sets, your strength potential would be very, very high. But you still have to develop it, right? You have to develop it. So what you saw there, look, me learning how to strain, having to press against a maximal force and missing it in that case, right? Close grip floor press is pretty tough, by the way. So some people might look at that and go, oh, I bet I could bench more than you. Like, I can bench more than that too. But the point is, it teaches you how to strain. And what we know is that maximum strength is only developed, it's only developed when you start getting above 90% of your 1 rep max. When we start getting above 90% of 1 rep max, you're not going to rep that. Right? Very, very rarely are you going to be able to hit a double or a triple with anything above that. There might be cases where you could, but more often than not, if you even attempt a second rep with weights in those range, you're usually going to fail it, at least 50% of the time. So by dealing with weights that are above 90%, we learn how to lift maximally. Well, that matters. It matters because you have to learn how to strain against stuff, and you have to learn how to find your groove. So it's very, very different to lift a moderate weight for a bunch of reps versus lifting a really heavy weight. What you're going to find when you go to grab a very heavy weight, there's only going to be one technique and method that lets you lift the most weight. And when you're using different max lifts, oftentimes you will find that groove. In other words, if you're doing a pen press and you get to a weight that's starting to get to 90% of your max or more, you're going to find that the pen press that you used before won't work. Meaning there's only going to be one spot, there's only going to be one bar path where that bar is above your chest, say on a bench press that way, or a squat. There's only going to be one position in which you can actually get the weight started. It won't break off the pins otherwise. Same thing when we start getting to a deadlift, like a sumo deadlift like this that I'm doing off of blocks, because blocks can put you in a slightly more awkward position. Sometimes you're going to find there's only one position to where you can even break the weight off the floor. Because a sumo block pull actually is weakest off the floor. If you're going to fail that, you're going to fail at getting it moving. You're going to fail it in the first couple inches. You're only going to find one position that lets you break a weight that's 90% or higher off the floor. It won't even move off the floor sometimes, unless you find the perfect position. What you could do with an imperfect position, you might be able to do 10 reps with 70% of your max, even with a bad position. So by lifting maximal weight, it teaches you how to find your body positions and leverages to lift maximally, to move the most weight. So not only do we learn how to strain, We learn how to grind and strain and find positions. Because if you're doing a max, you're ramping up. People think of who don't ever max out, they think that you just walk in and hit a max. That's not what you do. If you watch here, I'm doing all these weight jumps, bump, 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 bump. All right, started with 485 right there, and worked my way up over multiple singles up to 600 pounds. As you ramp up, you start finding your grooves. And when you're doing rep work, you don't get to find your grooves the same way. You might get to practice your setups, but you don't dig in and find the grooves. You don't find the positions where the weight moves the fastest and easiest. So it teaches you to learn to find your groove. Now, that's true of any lift, but what happens when you do it like we do over in Conjugate and you have 20 or 30 different exercises you max out on through the year? Or even more. Then what happens is you're having to find your groove all the time. You're learning how to, at any given time on any day, put yourself into awkward positions you haven't quite done in a while and find the spots where you have the best leverage and bar speed and power so that you can actually lift a weight above 90% without failing it. You get used to finding it all the time. Well, what does that do for strength in the real world? It carries over tremendously. It's one reason this system works so well for athletes. Because when you hit somebody on a football field, or even, that's the same thing, you talk about grappling. When you're grappling people, you're going to be put into awkward positions. So if you're used to pulling and pushing and everything in awkward positions all the time and having to find the best leverages month after month, year after year, when you get put into situations and positions to where you are having to push or pull against something really awkward maximally, could be another person, you've learned how to find your grooves. You've learned how to use your leverages. Right? That's what maximum strength is. That's the main difference. Maximum strength is, can you push as hard as possible and find your leverages? Because outside of that, only speed and hypertrophy matter. But this develops it. It develops that skill. You learn how to strain. You learn how to groove. You learn how to find your groove. You learn how to reposition stuff if you get slipped out of your groove. Okay, that's part of why we do max effort. What's the other reason? Find your weak points. You know what I said earlier, that you can only learn to lift maximally by lifting maximum weights? Well, what about form breakdown and weak points? Now, if someone does a 5-rep set to failure and you see where their weakest link is, you have some idea where their weak links are. But what about when they strain against a really heavy weight? Because a lot of times what happens when people reach failure on rep work, and 5s is definitely rep work, it's usually fatigue that's caused it. It's an accumulation of fatigue that you'll start to see form break down, and the weakest muscles maybe are getting fatigued. That's what you see. But when you're focusing and concentrating on setting up perfect and doing a heavy single, and then you either grind and it slows down and you almost miss a rep, or you miss a rep, what happens? You see the weakest muscles come out. Because we don't have general fatigue. It's a matter of, are you strong enough to lift that weight or not? And if you're struggling with it, there's a weak link somewhere. There's a weak link somewhere relative to the weight you're lifting on your body, right? It lets you identify those. And the same thing, when you either miss a rep or you hit a really slow grinder, when you go to hit a max effort lift and you have to grind it, anyone who's ever done this, what's one of the things that you notice? You always have a muscle that hurts. Well, if you have a muscle that feels almost strained when you grind against, or in some cases fail a max lift, what you feel, that's probably the weak link. That wouldn't have come out doing a bunch of 5s or 10s. You wouldn't get that same feeling. But when that muscle feels almost strained because it pushed maximally with everything that it had and it wasn't quite enough and other muscles had to help compensate, because that's what we're looking for, is compensatory strength. We're looking for compensation. Well, when you see where your weakest muscles are, either through feeling them or observing the breakdown of the technique, when you use compensatory strength to make sure that you keep moving a weight because you have a weak link somewhere, we see the weaknesses. And if you know where the weaknesses are, we can then come back through with a bunch of rep work and hypertrophy those areas. Because again, outside of the other stuff we talked about, where does all the rest of your strength come from? It comes from hypertrophy. So if you know what the weakest muscle is, you need to bulk that muscle up. It needs special attention. The max effort work helps you find it. And you can find that weak link on all these different lifts. You find it on all these different lifts. Alright guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.